Hello, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session on AI standardization. We called it AI Standardization Bootcamp, as there's a lot happening on standards, specifically on AI, and increasingly they'll become quite important. So the goal of this session is to get everyone a bit up to speed on what is happening around AI standardization so that you have this knowledge and can use it to your advantage in the future. So on the agenda for today, our first part will be given by me. I'm Jelle Hudemakers, and I will do first a general introduction on standardization. What is it? And afterwards, I will take a look at the international level, specifically everything that is happening at ISO, IEC on artificial intelligence standards. After that, we will have someone joining remotely from Denmark, Kim, who will make the link between the AI Act, specifically the requirements for high-risk artificial intelligence and AI standards. And afterwards, we have the pleasure to have Sebastian Hallensleben, who is the chairperson of the European AI standardization effort, who will come to give a bit of a focus view on what is happening at the European level. And I will end, of course, with a final comment, mainly as well, how to get involved, because standardization is a process where anyone can participate in different forms and modalities. So I'll share some information on that. So as mentioned, the speakers for today, Kim Skoff Hilding from Danish Standards will participate. So he actually holds the function of secretary of the JTC 21. No worries, there are a lot of names and numbers which you might not recognize now, but the goal is that you recognize them after this session. So he's a secretary for JTC 21 on AI at the European level, but he's also quite active internationally in AI standardization. Next, we have Sebastian Hallensleben from VDE in Germany, who is a chairperson, and basically his CV is a bit too long to go over it, but he is very active in a lot of different international fora like ISO, IEC, but also OECD. He is very active in Germany as well on specific projects, but he'll be telling more about that. And then me, I work for Agoria. Agoria is the Federation for the Technology Industry in Belgium. And specifically at Agoria, we also manage the Belgian participation to multiple standardization activities. So what I do there, I'm the secretary of the Belgian AI Mirror Committee, of which I'll tell you a bit more later on. So first, on standards. Standards, for me, are a bit the unsung heroes of our time. They're not known, but still we use that day to day, every day, continuously, we're surrounded by standards. I'd like to highlight maybe two here, two specific standards, not relating to AI, but to give you a general idea of what it is about. And first is the ISO 3103. Anyone know already what this might be about? Not directly. The ISO 3103 is an international standard which specifies a standardized method for brewing tea. Meaning that someone went through, let's say, the challenge of trying to set a standard for brewing tea. Which for me, if I make tea, it's just, I boil water, I throw in a bag of Lipton black tea, and that's it. But no, people went through a process to define this. I have a slight feeling that this is maybe coming from the UK somewhere, that is being pushed. And there we see the full description of how you actually brew a standardized cup of tea. You should have a white porcelain pot or a glazed earthenware pot. It should hold maximum 310 milliliters plus minus 8 milliliters. 2 grams of tea measured to 2% accuracy per 100 milliliter boiling water need to be added. So this is really something in very detail, which is specified how to brew tea. The question is this a practical standard? As a standard which you would use? Well, I personally, not really, but you might imagine the UK being a tea country, that certain establishments who serve tea want to differentiate themselves. And maybe they could say, okay, we brew standard according to the international standard of brewing tea. You might even consider, I don't know if there's a market for it, but certain companies who say, we can certify you against this standard, so you can really show to your customers that you're brewing quality tea. If you ask me, not that big of an impact, but it shows a bit what it is about. Another standard I want to focus on with a bit more impact, according to me, is the ISO 6346. I'd ask what is it about, but I don't think anyone will know it. But this standard is on the design of shipping containers, also something which is standardized. And to take you a bit into the story of how this happened, in the past, like in the 1950s, we had a situation that, of course, we had international logistics, but how does it work? Each item individually was loaded onto a ship, meaning you have a bag of sugar, we load it onto a ship. We have a tractor, we load it onto a ship. And in certain ways, this is, was quite impractical, meaning you need to handle each item individually. It's unreliable. You can't really calculate how much time does it take to load something on a ship, which is then maybe causing delays and stuff like that. It's slow. Theft was also a very big problem. People just stealing things out of bags and boxes. And the situation was that there were existing containers, but they were all different sizes, meaning each transport company had their own container, their own way of doing it, which basically caused problems, as you could not really reliably load these things onto a ship, for example. But then came Malcolm McLean, who was the owner of a trucking company, who really had a big headache of all these logistic problems. And he said, let's sit together with some of the shippers and try to work on a standard for shipping containers. And that's how this was born. The concept was, let's try to make agreement between the different transporters on the dimension. And actually, this had a huge impact. These things are not so visible, but if you look towards the, in 1965, loading cost for a ship per ton would be estimated around $6 per ton. If you look then 5 years later, when these containers were introduced and used, you have a reduction of to $0.16 per ton, which is insane. The loading capacity an hour as well improved from 1.7 ton to 30 ton. Next to that, you see that theft dropped dramatically. You have larger ships because they can be built based on the design, less port time, a more efficient organization. So a lot of benefits are coming with it. So even they did studies on this, and it shows that actually the concept of containerization, meaning using the same standard, had an increase between 65 and 70 caused an increase of 320% in world trade, and even larger if you look at the bigger scale. If you compare it, a free trade agreement, for example, has only a 45% increase. And so just to say, practically, the design and application of a standard has a major impact on the economy. And this is not the only standard which has a continuous impact on our life. So then we come to the first question, what is a standard? There are multiple ways of defining it, but the most easy is just to say it's an agreed or common way of doing things together, things we can define later. Think about the fact that we agree on time zones. There's no logical explanation why we divide everything in different time zones and hours, but you can imagine aviation would not really be possible if each country, each zone would use their own time measurements. Same as a keyboard, for example. At a certain point, it was just decided, okay, this is the layout for a keyboard. I think you can imagine the difficulties if all different laptop computer providers would use different types of keyboards, how to use this. So there are a lot of benefits of doing it like that. So as mentioned, a generally accepted way to do something that is a standard. And to do something can be multiple things, can be designing a product, can be building a process, it can be implementing a procedure, can be provide a service. So there's a wide range of applications for standards. Now let's take a look a bit at the different types of standards, because basically we can split it up into two types. From one side, we have the de facto standards. De facto standards are standards which are widely adopted by consumers or by industry, and they just become a standard due to the critical mass. It's not that someone decided beforehand, okay, this is now the standard. No, due to the fact that everyone is using it, it becomes a standard. Like, for example, a QWERTY keyboard. At a certain point, it was that big. Yeah, and Azerty here, a good comment. But that's only, I think, Belgium and France maybe. But QWERTY is, let's say, the common de facto standard. Windows operating system can also be considered as the structure of a website. That's also not a standardized way, but it's just something which appeared, which had critical mass. But next to that, we have the formal standards. And these are standards which can, in a way, at a certain point, start as a de facto standard, which are then formalized by an official standardization organization. And there we come into the let's say, the maybe complexity of standardization, that all these standardization organizations are characterized by official procedures and processes. Procedures and processes are super important when it comes to standardization in general. I'll come back a bit on that later, on the procedures. Types of standards, we have standards on terminology, compatibility, on safety, product, test methods, installations, on processes. So there really are a lot of applications. And then the question is also maybe, why should we standardize? And we saw the example already of the shipping containers, but there are multiple benefits of standards. One is allowing economies of scale. If you use an international standard, which is accepted not only here in Belgium, but also in the US and China, you access a whole international market. So for economic reasons, it's quite easy to scale your products or your services. It facilitates interchangeability of products and services. At digital level, we talk about this as interoperability. Using standards promotes the collaboration of different tools, different software components. It stimulates competition, it removes trade barriers, it promotes safety of products. That's also at the European level, something which is very important. We use almost all products that you see here, from this microphone to the wall socket to the camera, will have certain safety standards as well to guide them in the design. Next to that, and this is probably the reason why most people here are listening to this talk now, is because it helps manufacturers or designers of products and services comply to European legislation. We'll go a lot deeper into that later on. It helps the transfer of research. It works on safe and healthy environment and promotes common understanding. Okay, now, if we look to the, let's say, field of standardization, it becomes quite complex quite fast. Here you have an overview. This is not specifically on AI, but more on communication and IoT, connected devices. You see here a list of all organizations that are developing standards in a certain field. And there's also a lot ongoing on AI, but this is just to show that often for stakeholders in this process, it's quite complicated to find out, where are relevant standards being developed? And next to that, how can I get involved? Because all these different organizations have different governance mechanisms, have different modes for participation, for introducing a standard, for the development of the work. So it becomes quite complex often. I'll not focus on all of these today. As mentioned, what we're doing now is focusing on artificial intelligence, specifically with the link to the AI Act. And that is why today we'll mostly be talking about standards coming from the international level at ISO IEC, and European standards from the European level coming from CEN-CENELEC. But this gives you a general overview of how everything is organized, because specifically, if you look towards the international standardization for ISO, IEC, and ITU, there are very structured processes and collaborations put in place between, let's say, the international community, the European community, and then the local community. So I'll quickly run you through that. So at the right, we see what are, for us, the three main standardization development organizations. One is ISO. That's basically, it's not easy to summarize all the standards that they do, but for me, they're the daily standards. Standards for processes, standards for safety for certain products. Next to that, we have ITU. ITU is mostly occupying with telecommunication standards, and IEC is occupying everything relating to electrotechnical standards. So this is a bit historically how these been worked out, but what we see now is that due to the fact that we're all in a digital age, these competences are a bit blurry, but that's actually not bad because we also see a collaboration between these three organizations. Now, what you see is that these international organizations are mirrored at the European level. So we see ISO, let's say the European equivalent you could see as CEN, of IEC you could see as CENELEC, and of ITU as ETSI. Also, what is well established and also quite important is that there are specific agreements in place between the international and the European standardization bodies to align. Because the general idea about standardization is we would always want to have an international standard. That is let's say the baseline to start from. Why? Because that offers a lot of benefits, specifically economically and to access to the market. But for certain cases, we say we cannot really make an international standard. If there's a specific European context, then at that point, then we will start working within a CEN or CENELEC or together to develop a European standard. So the idea is always, and that's what these agreements are about, first try to develop it internationally. If it's not possible due to some reasons, go to the European level. And then there you see at the left side, the Belgian standardization field. In Belgium, we have two standardization bodies, the NBN, the National Bureau for Standardization, and BEC-CEB, which is the Electrotechnical Standardization Bureau. What these have to do, their responsibility is to bring together stakeholders around different teams. For example, now on AI, we see that there are actions at the international level for ISO and at the European level. What is then done, there's a national group created to participate in this European and international standardization field. To make it, and that's the final note on this slide, a bit more complex, is that, and that explains also my role in this story. What NBN in Belgium does differently than maybe in other countries is they use sectoral operators. This means that NBN notices that they don't really have, let's say, the connection to the ecosystem on standardization. So what they do is they request to other organizations to manage these activities. So in that sense, NBN has asked to Agoria, Agoria, will you operate the activities on artificial intelligence? And then we do so, and through that way, we, let's say, are managing this, this standardization committee. Some misconceptions on standards. Standards is not legislation. And that's often quite difficult for, let's say, people to really grasp, because most of the times when we're faced with standards in Europe, it's because we need to comply to a certain regulation. But the background or the reality is that standards are voluntary. There is no one who can say, force you to follow a standard. There are circumstances where, of course, you need to maybe follow a standard that can maybe be connected to a contract that you're in or a public procurement where they request adherence to a standard. But in general, a standard is not mandatory, law is, but they are indeed very closely connected. What we also see is that some people think that standards or using standards would imply that it's a very detailed design specification. That is also not true with a standard. The goal is always to define the minimum requirements, because otherwise there would not be, let's say, potential to innovate. And the idea is to set a sort of minimum baseline, which can then be used by companies, but they can develop things on top of it. Another misconception is that standards are only for large corporates. While if we in reality look to the standardization field, it is the fact that large corporates are very active in standardization, but that doesn't mean that as an SME, there is no benefit in participating. And I give you one example. Intopix, which is a company from Brabant Wallon, sorry, Mont-Saint-Libert even. So they are quite active already in standardization for quite some time, and they managed to sort of standardize their compression algorithm as an international standard. So which is interesting. A note here that this is not something that they just send to ISO and then at a certain point this becomes a standard. No, it takes work. It takes time. And that is indeed maybe the comment that for a large corporate, it's more easy to invest resources into this process. If you're a small company, then it can be quite complex. The difference between standards and legislation. Just to highlight again, standards are voluntary and regulation is mandatory. One you can choose to follow, one you have to follow. Regulation is also legally imposed, meaning that from the side of the politics or public sector, they impose a regulation, while a standard is something which is developed bottom up. It's a process where stakeholders come together, where they work together in a consensus mechanism to assure that together they can build a standard. As well, legislation is connected always to public authorities, while standards are more developed to independent organizations, like an ISO or a CEN. They are not politically driven. They are membership associations, and they have, let's say, separate business models with limited funding from the public. Also, standards, they follow a procedure, and normally a standard would be reviewed and revised every 5 years is when it's needed. But for regulation, it's a bit up to when the policymakers would decide it. A bit to show you the link between standards and regulation a bit better, I like to take this example. This example, sorry, I took it from a course I gave to students. It was a bit to trigger them, but it's on a condom. How are these then now linked? So from one side, at the European level, we have a regulation regulating medical devices. If you then look towards the classification of what is a medical device in the class 2A, which is the medium risk, you see that condoms are, in that sense, considered a medical device. This comes with requirements. If you are this device, you need to follow certain things. These are then set out in the regulation. And how can you follow these requirements? It will be the same for the AI Act. F1, you can do it yourself. You can look towards the legal text and assure that you take measures to assure that the product is safe enough. Or you could use a standard, in this case specifically the ISO 4774 from 2014, which sets out requirements and test methods for these types of condoms. And so from one side, it is not mandatory to use a standard to comply to the regulation. However, it's always the most easy process because in a standard, there's very detailed technical description of what you need to do. If you need to do that yourself, then yeah, basically you will lose a lot of time and effort without any, let's say, assurance that you're actually complying. A bit on the process, and that is also to show you a bit that as Belgium, we really have a say in this, because often this standardization is thought of as something more driven US, China, but the reality is that as Belgium, we can have quite a big impact. But I'd like to guide you a bit through the flow of how we arrive to a published international standard. So from one side, there always needs to come a proposal. A proposal can either come from a national body, from a national mirror committee, like for example, we as Belgium could go to the international ISO community with a proposal for a certain standard. And this is something you can do. Another flow is that directly from industry or from other stakeholders, for example, maybe in this context, European Commission, and there can come a sort of proposal or a request for standards. At this time, this will be registered as a new work item, and it will be a first time put up for vote, meaning that all participating countries in the governance of ISO, but also of CEN/CENELEC, will have the possibilities to either approve, abstain, or deny this new work item. So this is the first check at the national level, and there are many of these checks introduced, and this is what we say, this is the consensus mechanism, because if this process is not properly fixed and regulated, there are risks involved. There are risks that certain companies just try to push their technology as a standard without really consulting the market on it, and this can have quite negative consequences. But after this new work item proposal, it will start to the next stage draft. There can be multiple iterations then with the committee draft. There's a possibility at that point that the national bodies again give their view on a committee draft. The next step is a draft international standard. Then we move to a final draft international standard. And if this is voted through, then the standard will be published as an international standard and can then be used by stakeholders, and they can apply that. So you see, this is quite an extensive process, but I'd like to highlight again, it is important. This takes time, but if we don't follow these types of procedures, there are a lot of risks involved, that the standard is of low quality, and that maybe there are, let's say, actors who are using this standard maybe to push their technology and processes. If you look towards the time frame of a standards development, here, this is just a general overview. The main comment is that it takes quite a lot of time. Average 2 to 3 years is the time that you have for conception to the development of a standard. And this is something which will also be quite relevant for the AI Act, as there's quite a specific time frame as well for delivering these standards. Then let's look a bit towards specifically AI standards. So here, a general overview, I'll send out the slides later on, but it's just to show you that it's not only at ISO level that these AI standards are being developed, but multiple international organizations, like, for example, as well, an IEEE, an ITU, and ETSI at the European level, even at the national level in Germany, they're working on AI standards, which basically translates that it is quite a big field with multiple organizations working on something. But as mentioned, we are specifically looking towards ISO IEC. Why? Because these standards have the potential as well to be connected to the European regulations, where for others, it's a lot more difficult. So at the international level, ISO and IEC basically got together because they noticed that their, let's say, their target audience or their field of application was a bit mixed. IEC is coming from the electrotechnical side, ISO, the more general standards. And basically they said on digital standards, we will work together in the context of the Joint Technical Committee 1, the JTC1. But they have multiple subcommittees on a lot of things, but the one on artificial intelligence is called the SC42. So what we see here is that in total all over the world, there are 55 countries who are participating or observing in this work. They have currently published 17 standards and 27 more are under development. And specifically, we can split this up into, let's say, different working groups. One is a working group who's working on foundational standards. This is something that we see coming back often in specifically also the digital standardization effort. It's basically terminology, taxonomy, ontology. Why? Because specifically on AI, I think everyone can agree that people talk about AI with a different definition in mind. If you want to build a standard on artificial intelligence without actually defining AI in a certain standard, then we will have a problem of misconception. Then maybe one standard on AI trustworthiness will assume one thing, while another on AI safety will assume another definition of AI, which means this will not be workable. On data, also quite important relating to AI, specifically they're working on quite some interesting standards, which I think will be very relevant as well at the European level in the future for the AI Act. Most work actually is ongoing on trustworthiness, so specific standards which have to improve the trustworthiness of artificial intelligence. And then the final group is focusing on computational approaches. I gave an overview here. I will just fly through this. This is for your reference. You can also consult this online, but here's a view of different standards being developed. So foundation, it's concept terminology, framework for AIs using machine learning and AI management system. On data, here, I think the main interesting one is the 5 series standards, the ISO 5295 on data quality for analytics and machine learning. It's still under development, but I think this will be in the future really a guidance for stakeholders who are active in this field. On trustworthiness, quite a lot, everything relating to risk management, quality management, explainability, controllability, treatment of bias, transparency. on AI-aided decision-making, an overview of trustworthiness, assessment of robustness of neural networks, ethical and societal concern, square models, and then functional safety of AI systems. What you can see there as well is that these are in different states of development. Some are already published, some are at, you see the codes, final draft. It's really depending, but online you can really consult their status. Fourth one is specific focus on use cases with an overview of different use cases, AI systems, lifecycle processes, guidelines for applications. Yeah. And then the final one is on computational approaches. It's more technical. Overview of computational approaches for AI system, assessment for ML classification performance, reference architecture for knowledge engineering, and overview of machine learning computing devices. So this is just very briefly. Of course, these standards, not all will be relevant for everyone, and that's already quite clear. Certain will be connected to the European AI Act, but others might just be standards that are used by industry in the future in different contexts. So it's not all has the same relevance. This is a bit of an outdated picture, but I like it because it shows a bit the chaos and interconnectedness as well of these standards, because they might seem as all separate documents, but anyway, they have certain dependencies on others, and you see that the foundational ones are feeding in really to the ones on the applications and the implementation. There are also standards coming from, let's say, more outside of this subcommittee. For example, things like risk management is handled generally, but we see now as well a standard on AI risk management, which you could see as a sort of addendum to the existing ones. All right, as a final point, I'd like to briefly show a bit what a standard looks like. And I took the example of the 42001, the AI management system standard. This is just to show you a bit what it looks like. It always starts with a forward and introduction, but then the main important part is the scope. The scope is something which is often heavily discussed, so to say, because in the scope it is from the beginning decided what does the standard have to do, what is the goal of the standards, what shouldn't it do, can be there as well, to who is it applicable. So here you see the scope of this management system standard. Next to that, you will always have a reference to different standards and the normative references. For example, this management system standard, as referenced here, further builds on the concepts and terminology of AI. Specifically, there will always be definitions because maybe not everything is defined. So for clarity, because otherwise everyone, as mentioned, will have maybe different concepts. They define certain things, like here in this case, risk is the effect of uncertainty, policy, stuff like that. Then we get always to the content. And in this case, as it's a management system, it's really focusing on guiding companies in using AI in the management context. So it's more of a process and governance standard. So what we see here is that they highlight the context of the organization with certain points, highlight leadership, highlight planning, and then a whole range of other topics. So this standard is like 50-page document, I think, which really outlines and should be sort of guidance for companies who want to use AI. Annexes also always almost always included, specifically here. There are certain, let's say, checklists you could see with controls and objectives included. Other annexes here on implementation guidance, potential AI-related organizations and risk sources, and then specifically the use of AI management system across domain. And then, of course, we end with a bibliography with certain points there as well. So that's a bit, let's say, general structure of an AI, of a standard, and you're focused on the 42001. If you want to know more about one of these other standards, that is a bit my role in this whole process. And because I often get companies with questions. So the main idea is, maybe I triggered you with one of the standards before. Don't hesitate to reach out to me to ask, could you maybe share some information on that? I mostly can't send the standard directly, but we can, of course, help people understand what it means for them. before we move to the next speaker, and I'm quickly looking towards the people who are doing the practical things. We have the next speaker is available. Well, yeah. Maybe to highlight some other relevant standardization activities, specifically, what I personally think is very interesting is what IEEE is doing. IEEE is also a standardization body, more focused on engineering, but they really have a very extensive framework called the P7000 series relating to, let's say, ethical artificial intelligence and trustworthy artificial intelligence. So there's also something, even though I don't think it will be very connected to European regulation, it's still something which I advise companies to look towards if they're facing certain challenges. So don't hesitate to take a look at that. Do we have Kim available?
Yeah.
Kim.
Hello.
Right.
Hello, Jelle.
We cannot see you yet. I don't know if that's the...
My video is on.
Yeah, just a
maybe.
moment. The technical people are working on it.
Okay.
There we are.
I will start sharing my presentation maybe between this and see if that works. So I'll just have to move back to my Zoom here. So you're seeing my screen, right?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, but I'm sharing it, so maybe you should. Maybe
okay.
You're working behind the scenes to shift. So while we are working on digging my slides on the screen and trying to put on the video, maybe I can start by introducing myself.
Yep, there we are. Okay.
So what are we showing now? The slides?
Yeah, we show your slides.
And no video.
Yeah, yes, video. So you're all good. Let's go.
Okay, because I'm only seeing my slides, but that's okay. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to present here at this session. My name is Kim Skov Hilding. My role is a senior consultant in Danish standards, but I also have the position as secretary for CENELEC JTC 21, which is the European Technical Committee on Artificial Intelligence. I also work and follow the work in ISO IC SC42, and also have a role as a co-convener in an ad hoc group there. And this ad hoc group is focusing on which standardization deliverables that should be developed in a joint cooperation between ISO IC and CENELEC. So even though we are a European standardization organization, we still, of course, has a strong cooperation with ISO IC in order to ensure a global alignment of the standardization that we provide. Okay, so let's just shift screens here. So the first couple of slides is pretty much a recap of what Jelle just said, but I just wanted to recap anyway, because there is a lot of information given in this short session here. So just want to highlight and recap that standards do provide a very important role in society. It is a way to deliver a very clear and common understanding of which requirements, safety, and quality that are applicable to both product and services. But I'll not go through too much into this because Jelle has already touched upon that. And the same with this, but just to highlight that it is really up to you to make an impact here. As you see here in the center of the circles is European stakeholders, and that is you. So every company or organization who has a desire to impact standardization, and that is both within artificial intelligence, but also within all other areas, of course, has the possibility to contact your national standardization body, and Jelle can help you in the Belgian part. And in other countries, we have the same national standardization bodies, which can help you become an active expert in CEN, CENELEC, ISO IC. And in that way, you can participate directly in both if you want to write and participate directly in the development of standards, but also if you just want to follow the development and get early insight on how this is progressing. So Jelle just displayed all the different standards that are being developed, and you have an access to them before they are published if you participate as a member of some of these working groups. So I will very much invite you in regarding to artificial intelligence to join your national body and then join the work of JTC 21, which is the Committee for Artificial Intelligence. Okay. So the special thing regarding European standards is that when you have a European standards and it's published by Sentinel member countries, you actually have to withdraw the national standards that might be conflicting with this. So this is very much aligned to the idea of the single market, that we should not have a national standard in each country, but we should try to have European standards or ISO standards. But this is only applicable for European standards, that if you develop a European standard, it is applicable in all member countries. And if we have conflicting national standards, we have to withdraw them. If we adopt an ISO-IEC standard and make it so it's an EN/ISO/IEC standard or an EN/ISO standard, then it's the same. So then the ISO standard will be adopted as a European standard and therefore applicable in all member countries. So that the member countries are the European Union plus extra countries. So Jelle also touched upon the role of harmonized standards. I will go a little bit more into to details with that. But first, I want to touch upon the development of standards that we see over the last few decades. So as we see here, this graph displays the development of international standards, European standards, and national standards. And as you can see in the mid-80s, there was a very significant shift from developing national standards and going into focusing more on European standards. And the main reason for that is what we call the new approach, which is an initiative taken by the European Union, which gave more focus on European standards. So that really accelerated the use of European standard, and also meant that many national standards were withdrawn. And also, as you see, of course, the focus on international standard also accelerated. So a part of the new approach is the concept of harmonized standards. So how is harmonized standards? What is the role here? So the basic principle of the new approach is that all the legislative harmonization is limited to adoption of essential safety requirements. So Jelle also gives some examples of safety requirements. And actually these safety requirements or requirements of more general interest, which also is the case regarding artificial intelligence, is the harmonized rules that products or services must conform to in order to put on the market in Europe. And also what is very central and what is really the main reason why the graph you saw before accelerated the use of European standards is that this is tasked to the European standardization organizations, Senelec, also ETSI, but in this case, when it comes to AI, the task of developing technical specification standards that will support the upcoming regulation within AI is tasked to Senelec, and that is then the JTC Joint Technical Committee number 21, which deals with artificial intelligence. So this has already been highlighted by Jelle, but technical specifications are not mandatory, but it is much more easier for companies if they use these harmonized technical specifications or standards, because as also explained earlier, that when using harmonized standards, you get the presumption of conformity. If you're not using harmonized standards, then it's up to your own company to document that you are in compliance with the EU regulations. So in that way, we have, as the figure illustrated, we have both a top-down and a bottom-up approach here. You have the European Union who sets the regulatory requirements in different acts or directive. You have the machine directive, for example, you have the radio equipment directive, and all these directives are supported by harmonized standards. And then you have, as a company, to deliver technical documentation, of course, to prove and ensure that you have compliance with these regulatory requirements. But the presumption of conformity is really an important term here, because that makes the life much easier of companies when you want to put product and services on the European market. Okay, so this is a little bit the same, but illustrated in another way. Again, we have the top-down approach where we have the Parliament, the Commission, which is the public authority, which make mandatory legislation, which define which goals are set, the political goals, which defines the requirements that to protect societal interests and concerns. And within AI, of course, this is a very highly focused area where we are not just focusing on technical requirements, but very much from a political level also are looking into the societal interest, into the ethics of using this technology. And so some of the requirements coming from the Commission to Sense and Elect is very much focusing on both technical requirements, but also societal interest, which we then have to translate into technical requirements in some way. So that's one of the issues and challenging here, of course, to translate all this societal interest into technical standards that the producers and users of AI can use in when they apply the technology. So that was the top down. The bottom up approach is that the standards and what will become harmonized standards is developed by Sense and Elect and the European Standardization Organization. And as was shown before, it's not really the Sense and Elect Standardization Organization and the people employed here, like me and others, who develop these standards. It's actually companies, it's universities, it's consumer organizations, unions, and so on. All organizations and companies who would like to participate has the possibility, and that's why it is very much this bottom-up approach, which is based on hopefully the state-of-the-art best practice of the market, and that is also very much the idea of standardization, that this is not something that is a purely top-down approach from the European Union. This is very much also supported by the input and the expertise of companies and experts who has the possibility to deliver the best practice technical requirements, so that it's usable for all kind of companies and organizations. Okay, so this is just some terms that are very useful to know. So how do we actually, what is the actual process of getting to a harmonized standards? The first process is that the European Commission issues a standardization request. So in this standardization request, they list a number of themes or a number of important areas that they want the standardization organization, Sense and Elect, to develop standards within. So this is very much an open framework, which then Sense and Elect has to prepare a work program, who has to list the number of standards they're going to develop as homegrown European standards, or they're going to adapt from ISO, IC, or others. And then this work program is being approved, and Sentinel approves, accepts the standardization request, and then the work starts on developing European standards. But in the process of developing standards, it's also mandatory that Sentinel involves what we call a hash consultant. Hash consultant is contracted by the European Union to review these standards to see if they are delivering on the standardization request, if they have the content that will make them valuable as technical specifications that will support the intentions in the upcoming act, and in this case, the Artificial Intelligence Act. And when we have gone through the process, when the standard has been approved by the hash consultants, then this will be an harmonized standards as soon as it's published in what we call the official journal. So in the official journal, you can find all standards that are harmonized. So if you are in doubt, you can also always consult the official journal. And before the standards is published there, it is not a harmonized standard. So sometimes you have to use actually maybe an older version of a standard until the new version actually gets through the harmonizing process and gets published in the official journal. So this is the status for this area is that we have a standardization request. It has been accepted by Sentinel, and we are in the process of developing the work program that is going to be approved by the Commission. And when it's approved, we can start working on the standards. That's not completely true. We are already started working on the standards because we are quite sure on which topics and how the work program is going to be. But formally, it has not been approved. We are still preparing the work program, and it's going to be presented to the European Commission within the next couple of months. Okay, so some of you are probably familiar with this risk-based approach, and this is taken from the AI Act, and this is a very central part in order to regarding the development of standards. So we have the unacceptable risk. This is the uses that will be prohibited. So this is not something that we have to develop standards to support, because this will be illegal. And you can see the examples here, the social scoring example that will not be acceptable in Europe. So then we have the high risk. High risk could be recruitment, medical devices. This is where standards are very central. This is where standards, these companies or products needs to be in compliance with harmonized standards in order to document that they live up to this AI Act. And the same with the medium risk. Here we will see some specific transparency obligations, which can also be supported by harmonized standards. And even the minimal or no risk standards can still be relevant, because as stated before, standards are best practice and can be very much relevant for all kind of companies when they are developing this technology, even though they are not a part of the medium or high risk approach. Then standard can still be very relevant for this. Okay, I will pass through the actual cutout of what a standardization request looks like. You're not supposed to read all this, but this is just to show you how the level of details. So you can see it's very high level. You have 10 themes being shown. I just put in the keyword for each theme, so it's easier for you to see. But you have a theme regarding risk management. So we are tasked with developing standardization deliverables on risk management, quality, governance and quality of data sets, logging, transparency, human oversight, accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity, quality management, and conformity assessment. So this is what is actually listed in the standardization request that has been accepted by Sentinel-X, and that we are currently in JTC 21 developing our work program to support. So I will not go so much into details with this. You can download the complete AI standardization request from the European Commission website if you want to go into details, but this is the overall themes. And you can see that there are a deadline for developing these standardization deliverables, and it's in January 2020. So within the standardization work, this is a very tight deadline. Normally you say that the standard will take 3 to 5 years to develop, and that is what we have seen at the ISO level also. So we are in a very tight schedule here, and that's also why the work already started 1 year ago when we established the JTC 21 as a new joint committee between Sentinel-X. Okay, and let's see here. So this is how we are organized. Jelle just walked you through the different working groups we see in SC42, JTC ISO IC JTC1, SC42, the Committee on Artificial Intelligence in ISO IC. So this is how we have organized the working groups in JTC 21. And again, this is very much a bottom-up approach. This is not working groups that has been given from the Commission or from the board of Sentinel-X. This is working groups that has been based on the different suggestions for standardization deliverables, and in that way we have come up with these different working groups. And this is not a final view. This will probably be developed where working groups will new working group will appear, and existing working groups will close down when their projects are finished. So we have the first working group is just it's not a working group that develops standards. This is a strategic advisory group. So this is more developing of work program, outreach to other standardization organizations, more strategic discussions, and so on. And we have 3 working groups that are developing standards. You can see the names listed here are the conveners, or the persons or experts that are leading this work. And we have the operational aspects, engineering aspects, and foundational and societal aspects. I will not list the different projects here. If you are interested in more details regarding which projects are being developed, please contact me. We can supply an overview of the projects, but this is very much an evolving picture. So each month we are adding projects to the work program. So please consult me for an updated overview of the projects. So this is just to say that that if you review the standardization request, it says that we should develop standardization deliverables, and the standardization deliverables is actually a series of different types of publications. So we have, if you can see, we have one of the axes, the use of time, how much time does it take to develop this standardization deliverable, and on the other way, the level of normativity. So how specific are the technical requirements in this standard? And as you can see, the first type of deliverable is a technical report. This can be looked upon like a guideline. So this is not, I don't have any technical requirements here, but according to this the standardization request that we have currently, it is perfectly okay to deliver a technical report within as a deliverable to support the AI Act. But in the long run, this has to be converted into an European standard, and as European standards, the ENs are the only documents that can be transformed into harmonized standards. But as you can see here, in order to reach the deadline, in order to slowly build up the consensus in Europe, a road could be to start by developing a technical report, then add some more technical requirements and do a technical specifications, and in the end publish a European standard. So whenever you use the word standard, it actually refers to several types of publications, but normally, of course, it refers to the European norm, the European standards, the most comprehensive technical document that we publish as Sentinel-Lec. Okay, I have an eye on time, and I think this is the last slide here. So this is just to sum up what we are doing in JTC 21. Currently, we are identifying what standards that are already being developed in ISO, IEEE, ETSI, and so on, reviewing the needs and gaps for homegrown standards. And we are developing the work program in support of the AI Act and the standardization request. And we are already started developing projects. We have 4 approved projects, homegrown projects in JTC 21. We are also adopting several ISO IEC standards currently. And we are trying to do even more outreach to have more experts. This is also why we prioritize to be at this session, to invite you to join this work, to reach out to a national standardization body, and you're also very welcome to contact me if you have any questions. But please, if you find interest in this, invite you very much to join the work. And of course, the deadline is to publish the first standards, the first technical reports in the beginning of 2025. So this is the last slide. You have contact information here, both my personal contact information, but also the email to the Secretariat of Sentinel-Lec if you have a more formal questions to the overall Secretariat and the work of JTC 21.
All right, super. Thanks a lot, Kim, for this. Yeah. A lot of information in 30 minutes, so it's but maybe just because there's one question I see in the chat, which I'll try to address first. The question from Marina: where can we find the details of what working group does what? Good question. Marina, I'd like to ask you to listen also to the next speaker, because Sebastian will give let's say maybe more detailed overview of the specific work program. And after that, of course, I will be at your, let's say, assistance if you need more information. Given time, sorry, I had some questions for you, Kim. Maybe I can ask them a bit later on, but I would propose to directly go to Sebastian Hallensleben. Sebastian, can you hear us, and can we hear you?
Yes, I can, and only you can answer your second question.
Okay, so we have a good connection with Germany. All right.
Excellent.
So,
I'll share my screen.
All right. I think maybe, Kim, you need to stop sharing. All right. Okay, we have visual on your screen, so yeah, ready when you are, Sebastian.
Excellent. Right, so thank you very much for inviting me to this event, and also thank you, Jelle, for providing a really deep and excellent introduction to how standardization works, and to Kim for connecting it to AI standardization in Europe. I'll try to pick up from where Jelle and Kim left, and dive a little bit deeper into the content and also some of the challenges around AI standardization in Europe. Quick word about myself. You can see a number of hats listed here. Also about my organization, it's an old organization, so this is not a typo. 1893, founded at a time when electricity was the new exciting technology that required all sorts of standards. And today, one of the largest engineering associations in the European Union, and really a bridge builder between research and application, also involved in safety and performance testing, and of course, being one of the 2 German pillars of standardization. And in fact, I'll accelerate a little bit through here. You can see that within those 3 tiers, the international, European, and national tier, VDE with its standardization arm DKE is at the national level, the second pillar in parallel to DIN. And one of the things I would like to point out in this picture, even though Jelle has shown a similar one, just rotated by 90 degrees, if you remember, there is also a pre-standardization activities at the national level, putting together a standardization roadmap, which in effect is a very large-scale study to try and identify standardization opportunities and needs, which are now being analyzed and might lead to further input both to the European and the international level. And Jelle and Kim have also already explained the new approach or new legislative framework, which is the trigger for a lot of our work in JTC 21. Kim has also pointed out the standardization request already, and I'd just like to reiterate one point that Kim mentioned. This is pretty much all the accuracy there is. There are about 2 or 3 explanatory sentences for each of those items, but that's it. That's all that we've got to work on in JTC 21 to build those technical standards. Or you could turn around the argument and say, well, that actually leaves quite a few degrees of freedom and leaves quite a lot of scope for the experts and the national committees involved in JTC 21 to shape the way to define and create the way in which European AI regulation can be implemented. So on this slide, we see the official terms of reference, the mission of JTC 21. And this has actually been worded quite carefully. Jelle already alluded to terms of reference discussions being quite heated and long-winded in some cases. So in the left bubble, the obvious create standardization deliverables for AI and its use of related data. That's quite relevant because it kind of connects another major field of standardization to JTC 21. Secondly, to consider the adoption of international standards relevant to Europe. Now, this is quite carefully worded. So if there are international standards already, it's worth having a look at them because it saves us a lot of time at the European level. At the same time, we can't really copy international standards automatically for European use because they might be created with different priorities in mind and they might actually not be suitable for the European context and might not cover all the European specificities, in particular the standardization request and the AI Act. So we need kind of a middle ground here. And finally, JTC 21's mission is to address European market and societal needs. And that is a twin approach that really goes back to the high-level expert group set up by the European Union in 2018 that delivered a report. And in fact, it delivered 3 reports covering both market impacts and innovation policy, but also societal impacts. So that twin track that I think is quite specific to Europe feeds through to the terms of reference of JTC 21 as well. And overall, of course, we are there to underpin EU legislation, policies, principles, and values. It's quite important to note, or quite remarkable actually, just how much interest and participation the topic of AI has generated across Europe. So at present, we've got 23 countries involved in JTC 21 and more than 130 experts directly working at the European level, plus several hundred more in the national mirror committees, possibly even into the thousands. We don't have an exact statistic there. And these are, as far as I'm aware, record numbers for standardization at the European level, and just underlines how important AI is at the European level. But of course, if you look into the working routine yeah, it looks very pedestrian. There's a room full of friendly people, sometimes also engaged in heated debates. This is a picture from the most recent plenary meeting in January this year. And experts are there in national delegations. So 2 or 3 people lined up. You can't probably, well, you can see Denmark. The little sign posted here. There's Luxembourg and the UK sitting next to them. And national delegations typically spend quite a lot of time preparing for those plenary meetings to formulate joint positions. So Kim already showed the kind of the top line of these of this table, and I'm not going to walk through each and every of those items, but I'd just like to give you a flavor of how those terms and how those work items actually look like in JTC 21. So first of all, I have to explain the color coding. So there are a few that have been developed at the international level, typically in ISO IC JTC1 SE42, and are being considered for adoption either unmodified or modified for European purposes. So those work items are really analysis and potentially adoption work items, and they include things like concepts and terminology, where it really doesn't make sense for Europe to have different terminology compared to the international level. They also contain quite a few of the governance and systems management related standards from the European, from the international level. If you look at some of the items in yellow, these are items that are developed specifically at the European level from scratch, although not quite from scratch. I'll come to that in a moment. And you can, for example, see work items on AI conformity assessment, on risks, on natural language processes, data governance, trustworthiness characterization, which is one of the bigger ones, green and sustainable AI, although that is probably going to move to the international level, and AI enhanced nudging. And there's also one item highlighted in green, and I'm very glad Jelle already explained the Frankfurt and in the Vienna agreement. These are actually items where parallel development between the European and the international level is planned, although there might be further items where some form of parallel development could be happening. So this gives you a flavor. This is obviously work in progress of the current items that are under development, and the standardization request is going to trigger further work items to make sure we have full coverage there. So one of the challenges that both Jelle and Kim have already mentioned is, well, normally developing a standard easily takes 3 or even 5 years. So how can we build solid European standards in 1 to 2 years? And I'm saying 1 year in the extreme case, because if you remember the process that Jelle showed, from the committee draft to a final committing draft and discussion loops and feedback loops that are built into the process, the actual technical work really only has around 1 year to complete. And then the second year is being taken up by all those feedback and input and polishing loops. So how can we achieve that? Well, in some cases, as I mentioned already, we're lucky. There is work already either completed or almost completed at the ISO IC level that we can adopt or adapt. Adaption meaning adoption with some modifications. The big constraint here is where available. It's no use to us in Europe if there are some plans in ISO IC or a working group has just started in ISO IC because we don't really know where their work is going, whether it's going to be finished in time, and whether we're going to have the time on top of that to adopt or adapt. So if a standard exists, is available, lucky us. If not, it doesn't really help us. We can also look at adapting standards from other standardization and similar organizations. So we can look at IEEE, at IETF, W3C, the OECD, Gaia-X, BDVA, and so on and so forth. Many of these organizations have produced deliverables that have some similarity to standards that are already the result of consensus building, at least among a broad spectrum of experts. And we can really consider picking up on that work to jumpstart, to be a starting point for building a European standard, which would then accelerate the time that is needed. The big proviso there is not only does some work need to be available, it also needs to be legal to make use of it. And in some cases, in particular in the case of IEEE, the ways in which organizations handle intellectual properties differ quite a lot. The processes differ quite a lot, and it requires strong discussions in the background to find ways of using existing work in a legal way. And finally, and I'll dive into that a little bit more deeply now, we can build on existing academic research and or open consortial specs. So consortial specs being standards that have not been created by all relevant stakeholders, but that have been created by, let's say, a coalition of the willing, by organizations that came together to create a spec, a standard for something that hasn't got the same status as full-blown European or international standards have, but nevertheless are an important step towards it. Again, we have the proviso where available, but quite often those consortial specs are open and free to use and built on, so at least we don't have that much legal issues to worry about. And I'd like to dive into one example that I've been personally involved in for a number of years, the AI Trust Standard and Label, the VDE Spec 9012. If we look on the right-hand side first, this started out in 2019 as a research project with a number of universities and civil society organizations being involved. The starting point was really to figure out, well, how can we get from this discussion around AI ethics principles to something practical and something that you can really measure and that you can enforce. And the initial ideas coming out of that work were also discussed in pre-standardization activities in Europe and the international level. So in Europe, that was the Sentinel Focus Group for Artificial Intelligence that produced a roadmap report already in October 2020. And at the international level, it was the IEC SEG 10, which produced its report a year later. And building on that work, and since it got fairly promising feedback from those pre-standardization activities, those actors, plus a number of further actors, got together to create a consortial standard. And the basic idea there, just to give a little bit of flavor, was to define a standardized label or a short data sheet that could be attached to AI products, similar to the energy efficiency label, really, where you can have ratings. For example, an AI product that has a transparency rating C and an accountability rating A and a privacy rating D. And this was really explored further by a consortium to try building a consortial standard that was published just a year ago. And you can already see that in addition to academics and civil society organizations, some fairly significant companies came on board there as well. But it was still at a stage of, well, we have to try this out. We don't really know whether it works, but in effect, it did work. And we now have a standard which is actually now also being polished by the organizations involved here. So I'd like to give you just 2 to 3, 4 minutes on what the challenges are in developing such a standard, not from a process perspective, but from a content perspective. If you say, well, yeah, that sounds kind of neat to have a data sheet for AI products similar to the energy efficiency label, but what categories do we include? Why those 5 categories? Well, that's a relatively straightforward question to answer. If you look at all the AI ethics papers that were being published in 2017, 18, 19, the EU high-level expert group, the OECD, UNESCO, G7, G20, they were all more or less saying the same. If you put them side by side, if you deduplicate the terminology, it's relatively straightforward to see which categories are really the ones that pretty much everyone mentioned. So that's an easy question to answer. The second question is much harder to answer. So how can we measure something like transparency or accountability? How can we come to a statement of saying, well, this system has got a transparency rating or level of C? Well, in there, and I won't dive into the detail here, there's effectively a tree structure underneath which specifies certain criteria, and for each criteria, certain indicator questions. And these indicator questions have dedicated specific ranges of answers. So it's not just a yes, no. It's also not a generic yes, rather no, no scale, but it's actually a scale that is specific for each of those questions. And this was the bulk of the work that the consortium did. You can imagine if you have 5 categories, in each categories, you've got 3 or 4 criteria at the second level. You have a handful of indicators for each criteria. So in effect, you have 100, 200 answer scales that you have to develop one by one. And then you also need some aggregation mechanism to go from those answers back up to a statement of saying, well, this is transparency level C, for example. And then the final question, and that is actually taking us back to standardization more broadly. What levels are acceptable in a given application? Is a level C transparency good enough? Is a level D of privacy good enough? And as an answer to that, I like to show this slide because this is very much outside the scope of standardization. This is the political decision under which circumstances certain characteristics of an AI system is good enough. And it was a very early breakthrough, and this is also why I'm talking about this example in some depth, to recognize that slicing and dicing the issue in that way, standard describes the system in a standardized way. Separating that from the political decision, what level, what characteristics are acceptable in a given use case, in a given risk profile, in a given sector or application. That was really a breakthrough which gave us the handle on making AI ethics and AI trustworthiness accessible to the tools of standardization and accessible to consensus building. And so we have a consortial standard now, and now the challenge is to feed that into the standardization process, because remember, this was just a coalition of the willing, and we can't really expect the rest of the world or even the rest of Europe to say, hey, that's awesome that you have that. We'll just accept it as it is. It has to be fed into the process. And if you look at the inside of JTC 21, there's a fairly systematic road mapping process going on that reviews European standardization needs, in particular coming out of the AI Act and out of the standardization request. It also reviews existing work from other committees and consortia, and identifies some gaps and potential activities to fill those gaps. But also, there is a bottom-up process, and this is actually the process that is more traditional for standardization, where ad hoc groups, where national committees, where experts spot individual standardization needs and also have existing work. And in the case of the VDE spec, the AI Trust standard and label that I just explained, it was a little bit of both. Obviously, there were some experts involved in the existing work who brought it into JTC 21. It was also introduced by the German National Committee. But also, of course, it plays a role when reviewing existing work in a systematic top-down way. And eventually, one of the skills and one of the important tasks of JTC 21 is to merge, to bring that top-down and that bottom-up view together to come up with new work item proposals that can be voted on, that have chances of success and being approved by national committees in those ballots, so that work can actually start on technical reports, on technical specifications and European norms. And that's the end and the conclusion of my presentation. I hope we have a few more minutes for questions, and looking forward to your input. Thank you very much.
All right, super. Thanks a lot, Sebastian. As always, very crisp and clear overview, so to say, on what's happening on AI standardization in Europe. Unfortunately, we're quite close to the end of our session. So what I propose is that I ask you a question, and if you want, Kim, of course, you feel free to chip in. When we talk about the standardization, which we, let's say, need to do under the AI Act, from one side, I think we have a need for certain technical standards, data quality, things like that. But there are other things, and then I'm talking specifically about human oversight, which from the perspective of a lot of people is very difficult to standardize that. Basically, the feedback is that maybe standardization is not the tool to work on a requirement for human oversight. But human oversight is in the standardization request. So what is your view on that? Will we be able to work out a standard on human oversight, or any thoughts? Maybe Sebastian, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm now taking off my JTC 21 hat, because as the chair of JTC 21, I need to take a neutral position. So I'm kind of pretending to be an expert for a minute. The way that this was solved needs to take into account that more human oversight is not necessarily better. So you can't say, well, let's have a standard for different degrees of human oversight, and the higher the risk, the more oversight you need. Because there are use cases, for example, the emergency shutdown of a power plant, where less human oversight is wanted, or where machines are actually better and make fewer mistakes than human beings. So again, you can't really say more human oversight is better. So that makes it quite hard, and makes human oversight a different beast, a different animal, compared to things like privacy or fairness, where you can always argue, well, more privacy is better, more fairness is better, more transparency is better. So that's a much simpler, in many ways, a situation. So within the AI Trust standard and label that VDE spec I just mentioned, the type of human oversight actually modifies the way in which those ratings are computed. So in different modes of human oversight, so on the loop, in the loop, human in command, answers to those questions in the tree structure I showed lead to different ratings, because we just recognize there are different ways in which human oversight operates. So it has an influence, but it's not reflected at the top level, as in the more human oversight, the better. Whether that carries through into JTC 21, we'll have to see. As I said, it's a starting point, or any consortial standard like that is a starting point for discussion, and we'll see how that evolves in the next year.
All right. Kim, anything you want to add on that, or?
Just to acknowledge that this is one of the challenges, of course, within this area, which differs very much from other standardization areas, that we have the societal concerns. In Denmark, we have the government very much using the word data ethics, where we within standardization have, at least in ISO, we had in the beginning a discussion on if we could use the word ethics in standardization, where they choose to use the word societal concerns instead. So this is just an illustration that we are working with the terminology here, and probably we cannot cover all the discussions that are going on in the public area and solve everything with standards. But at least we will translate the public discussion into specific terms and develop standards that support them in the best possible way. But of course we will see some gaps in this area.
All right, great. Thanks a lot for your insights. To end it off, I quickly want to show a final slide. How to do this best? All right. So just to end, I think what I hope the main conclusion is that there's a lot of things ongoing on AI standardization, and it's an open process. You can be a part of it if you want. So mainly just to highlight again what we are doing at Agoria, we are gathering the Belgian AI ecosystem who is interested and wants to participate to standardization, and we want to enable them to do so. There's a lot of specific things to do, but what I mainly would like to highlight is a bit the modes of participation, meaning that becoming part of the standardization community doesn't necessarily mean that you need to become active directly within a European working group. We see different modes. We see indeed people who are participating to the Mirror Committee to stay up to date, to be aware of what is being developed, which standards are in the pipeline, what are they looking like, just in that sense as a sort of observer mode. We have a lot of people who do it like this. But next to that, what we do as well is we organize every 2 months a national meeting of the stakeholders where we discuss the progress at the international and European level on AI standardization. We try to discuss, to gain insights from each other, to exchange views and to work on common positions for voting or to submit documents towards plenary meetings. And next to that, we also offer you the possibility, if you would want at a certain point, to participate to international meetings. We have potential to delegate Belgian participants to these international meetings. And what we hear from our experts is a great opportunity as well to network, to meet peers, to gain more knowledge and increase your network. And then specifically as well, we have the possibility to engage really into the writing of the standards. If there's something which you have a certain knowledge about or have an interest in, through this Mirror Committee, it's possible to really engage in this writing. So specifically, if you want to know more or want to be involved and you're a Belgian stakeholder, it's not only for companies, but also public sector or civil society, reach out to me to find out what you can do. So that is the main message I hope you take away at the end. So as a final point, I really want to thank Kim, Sebastian. Thanks a lot for enriching our session, for sharing your views on what is happening on AI standardization. I put your email addresses here. So as mentioned by both, if you have specific questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to them. They're really, let's say, two great guys who also want to drive AI standardization forward. And I think the main conclusion is that we can only do this together. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone, for attending, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.